So this is what the afternoon is going to look like. So I'm basically up here to go through the agenda, and then Jamie Ersick, the new head of SAPE, School and Educator Programs, will open up the discussion and introduce Paku, our presenter today. Then from 1:10 to 2:30 roughly, Paku will be talking about exploring the borderlands, understanding racial identity, place, and power. Then we'll take a short break, and then we'll come back, and then lastly, based on the feedback that we received from you guys, we'll have a group discussion concerning concerns, situations that make docents uncomfortable when talking about race in the gallery. So again, Paku will present up front, take a short break, and then have a conversation about situations and concerns about talking about race, okay? So without further ado, Amy. Oh, and as you can see, all our docent trainings this year have open captioning for those of you who have problems hearing.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you, everyone. How's everyone doing? I do want to give a shout out to David and Marla for their hard work in organizing such a robust training for all of you. So let's give them a hand. Okay, so in thinking about this training and the work each and every one of you do, I wanted to start out just by saying the mission of the Nelson Atkins, and that's where the power of art engages the spirit of community. And from our strategic plan, we are dedicated to the enjoyment and understanding of the visual arts. Why, yes. Okay. Is this better? Okay, so in our strategic plan, it says that we're dedicated to the enjoyment and understanding of the visual arts and the varied cultures they represent. And this would not be possible here without each and every one of you. The School and Educator Programs, SAPE programs, facilitates gallery learning experiences to 47,000 K through 12 students each year. As you've likely observed, visitor dynamics are constantly changing, and educators, all of us, we must continually learn and adapt in order to serve the needs of our community. To ensure that our visitors have meaningful and respectful gallery experiences, we as facilitators and lifelong learners ourselves must be prepared and equipped to meet visitors where they are in their personal experience. Do you feel that's what we do with our students and our tours? Now, you've proven yourselves to be highly skilled, thoughtful gallery educators, and I will commend you for the amazing interactive, learner-centered activities and discussions that you have in your groups. Now, not only do we, all of us here, teach students about art and the museum, you facilitate opportunities that improve their visual literacy, their communication skills. You ask them to think critically about what they see. Your tours contribute to their holistic learning by supplementing the math, the science, or the reading, writing, and arithmetic that we used to think of, those 3 R's, with what's now, I think, the 4 C's. The 4 C's of 21st century education, and that's communication, creativity, collaboration, and critical thinking. These are all highly desirable skills that you're contributing and working with the students for being successful 21st century global citizens. Similar to how we ask our students and visitors to think critically, today is an opportunity for all of us to think critically about our practice as educators. We learn, evolve, adapt, just as our audiences are learning, evolving, and adapting to the new ways of the world. But what we do, but what do we do when an artwork triggers a painful memory for a visitor? How do we respond when a student's observation is outside of what's believed to be socially acceptable? What can we do when an observation makes the group or even oneself feel uncomfortable? Are there tools, and what are these tools or skills that are there that can help answer an uncomfortable question and turn it into a teachable moment? These are tremendous opportunities for teachable moments, but how do we navigate them? Continuing along this year's docent training topic, focusing on adult learning, today's workshop builds on the presentation, if you think back, that Micah K. Thompson, the Director of Affirmative Action, Equal Employment Opportunity, and Title IX Coordinator at University of Missouri, KC, she taught on equity and implicit bias. Today will be, get my prepositions and verbs all correct here, is a working session, and it'll offer examples and tools for respectfully addressing and discussing structural racism and equity on your tours. Reflecting on your very thoughtful questions and forthright, sincere responses to this survey that David sent out, the Dealing with Difficult and Sensitive Issues in the Gallery survey, David, Marla, the education team, along with docent representatives, met, researched, and invited Paku Her, a racial equity and social justice trainer and member of the mayor's KC Race and Equity Initiative, to join us today to discuss effective ways of addressing difficult and sensitive issues in regard to race in the galleries. The goal of today is to define and build awareness around the social construct of racism as it relates and affects concepts of power and identity. Together with Paku, we will learn strategies for leveraging an uncomfortable situation, be it in the galleries or on your introduction, to deepen student learning. Please know, today is a collective discussion, and it's not intended to be a comprehensive list of situations and what to do in that situation. With this in mind, I'd like to invite you to listen actively as a group of, I'd say there's about 100 of us in here, all unique individuals. We may not always agree, but our goal is to gain a deeper understanding and those 4 C's, 3 of them at least: communicate, collaborate, and think critically. So before I introduce Paku and turn it over to her, I just want to ask you to look at these group norms and keep them in mind. I gleaned these from observing a lot of your interactions in your other docent meetings. And I'd just like to say, let's all speak from our own experiences instead of generalizing today. We'll use I instead of they, or we and you. It's okay to respectfully question one another, and let's agree to stay focused on the ideas and the topics. Let's be conscious of our body language, our nonverbal responses, and make sure that we're communicating respect and appreciation, and participate to the fullest of your ability. Community growth depends on the inclusion of every individual voice. One final quote from our Race Project KC collaboration with the Johnson County Library is from one of the young adult authors, Jason Reynolds. And he wrote that, "Be not afraid of discomfort. If you can't put yourself in a situation where you are uncomfortable, then you will never grow, you will never change, you'll never learn." And like we ask our students to learn and trust, I ask that we all do that today. So, with no further ado, I'd like to invite Paku Her up here to lead today's workshop. She's the principal of Zhang Development Group, a consulting firm that provides lectures, workshops, training, organizational development, transformative leadership coaching, and grassroots strategy development designed to build racial equality, systemic change, and shift culture. She has 22 years of anti-racism experience organizing. A decade, she was the director of a national racial justice training programs with Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training. And she spent 3 years at 18 Million Rising and is currently the digital advocacy, growth, and innovation campaigner with Parents Together. She's born and raised in the Midwest and takes great pride in representing Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders living in the nation's midsection. She believes there are invaluable stories to be told by people of color living in the most rural areas of the U.S. And today, we're honored and privileged to have her lead our workshop. So, Paku.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. I am fully aware of the weather myself because I have 2 children who are going to be picked up by a babysitter, and I'm hoping everything's going to go smoothly. There are lots of rules on a piece of paper in the kitchen about what they may or may not do when they get dropped off. I normally pick them up. So, although one of the things was you can put on your snowsuits and go outside if there's enough snow. I'm really, really pleased to be here. My name is Paku He. The English translation of my name is Paku Her. I live here in Kansas City, so I'm a Kansas Citian just like all of you. I've been here almost 14 years. My spouse and I moved here from Chicago. And Kansas City was, different 14 or 15 years ago. And we can analyze all the reasons why it's becoming one of the most popular places in the country, which probably maybe has something to do with gentrification and lots of hipsters like me moving here. Let's just be honest. We just tell the whole truth. It's great. There's great restaurants, and it's because people like me moved here. We can do lots of critical analysis about who we are and just tell the truth, which I'm hoping is what we'll do today. So I'm really, really thankful to be here. I love the Nelson Atkins. It's a real privilege to come. My younger daughter is 8. And she is a creative and an artist, and this is her favorite place to come. She loves to come and walk through the Block building. It's like that's her absolute favorite. Whenever we go to visit friends who live in other parts of the city, especially in Hyde Park, she always wants to drive past here on Rock Hill at nighttime so she can see the building. So I just want you to know that, yes, I'm a Kansas Citian, and yes, this is the work that I do, but one of my favorite people in the world loves this place, and this is her favorite place. And my children have both been here on tours with their schools and with their preschools and have taken classes in the basement. And so for you all, I think it's valuable to say, and for myself, to say that I'm here because I have a personal connection to this place, not just because folks wanted a trainer or a consultant to come and talk to you about race and equity and what that might mean for your work. So that's an important thing to share. A couple of other important things to share with all of you. The thing in my bio about being a Midwesterner is really important. I have done race equity work for a long time. I've done digital advocacy and campaigning work, political and advocacy work for a long time. And whenever I tell people I'm from the Midwest, I was born in Wisconsin, raised in Minnesota, lived in Chicago, now live here, people kind of don't know what to do. I had a boss once who said, "Oh, you live in Kansas City, Missouri." And I was like, yeah, that tells me a lot about you and your Californianess and your coastal base. Because what I think is underappreciated here in the Midwest is that there are a lot of folks wanting to do really good work. Work that some of us might call progressive, work that some of us might call leftist, work that is really about making our communities fairer and more just. And people have a really distorted notion of what's happening in the Midwest. And so the kind of conversation we're going to have today is like the kind of thing I pull out of my pocket when I have to prove to the coastal people that I know that really good stuff is happening here, and maybe you should move here. Also, you could afford a house here, and we're not running out of water, so there's that. So there's that. So anyway, all of that to say to you all, this is a bit about who I am, because I think if you're going to spend the next few hours with me, you should probably know more about me than just my bio. And I hope, too, that in the conversation that we'll be having today, there will be moments when you'll ask yourself, who am I in this place called Kansas City? Who am I in this place called the Nelson Atkins? Who am I in this conversation about race and equity and how to make learning more effective for the patrons who come here, but also for ourselves? Because we're not somehow magically or radically that different than the people who come here, because we are also the people who come here. So I invite you to, in whatever way possible, think about who you are and what that means for the conversation today. Okay, so we are going to talk about power and race today. Just like really easy stuff. Super easy, whatever. It's like, yeah, we'll have this kind of conversation all day long. I am curious to hear, though, or to see, if there's anybody in this room who has ever had or tried or had a conversation about race that did not go well. So join me if you've ever had that experience. So I'm glad to know that I'm not alone, because I'll tell you what, I've had lots of conversations about race that have gone about as bad as they could go. Like people were really angry at each other, or people who were friends are no longer friends, or people are terrified that that I'm gonna come in and point out who's the racist, and let's find them. Like it's some kind of scavenger hunt. That's really not why we're here. Because I actually think that it's not useful to approach race equity work that way. Now, that's not to say if somebody is overtly racist, just as if somebody is overtly, painfully, horribly sexist or classist or ageist, that we don't in fact hold that person accountable. We should. We should. And if that's our only strategy ever, you're probably going to create an entire group of people who are real skittish that at some point someone's going to call them a racist or a sexist or a whatever. Instead of saying, maybe there's a bigger conversation to have here about how people are learning these things and how we are or are not interacting with something that's much bigger than the one racist in the room that we would love to get out of here. Because I suspect that even if we could get out, check this out for yourself. If we could remove the one racist, because there's only one. If we could remove the one racist from the room, would racism end? No. I see heads shaking. Of course it wouldn't. Of course it wouldn't. It might make me feel better because then I can say, oh, that's the bad person and I'm the good one because I got the bad one out of here. Which, we probably should spend some time digging at. My therapist would tell me I have some work to do around that. But if we're going to recognize that something is bigger, that maybe we are responsible together for fixing this, then it's not as simple as finding out who's the racist and getting them out. Just like it's not enough to find out who's the sexist and getting them out, or who's the classist person or the ageist person and get them out of the room. Because there's a cultural norm that's happening that we're all experiencing. So we're going to dig at that a little bit. Now, in order to do that, we're going to talk about this thing called power. And I have been in lots of rooms where I discover that there are a lot of people who are actually very afraid or anxious about talking about power. Who's ever heard of the term power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely? Yeah, right. So that's a very common thing. I also learned that. And I think that, in fact, when we'll test this out in our own lives and in the conversation this afternoon, that in order to have an effective and useful and productive conversation about race, we have to talk about power. We have to. And we have to deal with what it makes us feel like, because power kind of makes people feel itchy or icky. Because I think that I'm probably not alone in this as well, that I've had interactions with institutions and in places where somebody had power, where it made me feel less than, or invisible, or unimportant, or undervalued, or not valued at all. So we have lots of feelings connected to power. So we got to sort that stuff out. But in order to have some framework or a container for our conversation, power has to be part of it. So I want you to just be prepared that this afternoon, you can imagine it, maybe a good metaphor or a good way to think about our afternoon is that we're going to be stitching a quilt together with some different pieces of content. I'm going to present some content to you. I'm going to ask you to think about this in your own life So I am going to ask you to meddle in your own life. And then I'm going to ask you to think about it in the context of the work you do here at the museum, this immense responsibility and role that you have here. It's a really important responsibility you have here at the museum. All throughout those conversations, the thread of the quilt that's going to stitch the quilt together is it's the thread of power. Not the threat, but the thread. Thread of power. So I want you to just hold that as what I'm going to be putting through the eye of the needle so we can sew together the conversation. And then we can see what the quilt looks like at the end. One other thing I should tell you about myself is that I'm a fairly informal person, so you might be fooled because I'm behind a podium right now, looking very important. But I'm a very casual trainer. So I want to be able to interact with you. I want you to interact with me. This is not a great space for small group work, but we are not, in fact, an enormous group. So if you've got a question or if you've got a thought, I want you to contribute it. And if we have time to answer, and if there's a way to answer it, I absolutely will. You'll be working in small groups as well. So you'll be doing some elbow conversations. I know you do some turning and talking in the trainings that you do already, so that's not a new practice. But we'll be relying on that too while we're together. So a bit of how the day will go. All right, any questions about where this airplane's going? I sometimes tell people it's important to do a flight check because if you meant to fly someplace else, now's the time to get off the airplane. So I think everybody's on the same plane. I'm not going to hold it against you if you're like, yo, I meant to go to New York and not Vegas, and this plane's going to Vegas. So, okay. So I want you to just very, very quickly, I think a lot of you know each other, but I think the education department is here, docents are here, there's a handful of other folks in the museum. I want you to answer this question very quickly. Turn to your neighbor and share with your neighbor who you are, and I've been asking this question, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Share with your neighbor very quickly one thing that makes you hopeful about doing racial justice work or thinking about racial justice or people fighting for racial equality during these times. I don't think it's unfair to say that these are challenging political times. Whatever side of the aisle you're on, these are challenging times. And race is feeling particularly tight and challenging these days, I think for most people paying attention to what's happening in the world. And I've taken to asking this question recently because my 8-year-old, who's the artist and maker and creative, she comes to a lot of meetings with me, a lot of community meetings and trainings. And several months ago, she came to a meeting where I went to work with some folks we were talking about police brutality and the violence being leveraged against black communities and black men in particular. And people were really angry, rightfully so. And we were trying to strategize and trying to think about what to do. And we left that meeting, and my 8-year-old said to me, people are really angry. Like, you go to a lot of meetings where people are angry. And I was like, yeah, there's lots of stuff to be angry about. Let me make you angry with me. Come on, child, learn. Right, let's be angry, righteous anger, and it is righteous anger. And she said, but what happens when people are just like angry all the time? What do you do? Like, are all of your meetings like this? And I was like, good point. I should think about this. And so it really did get me thinking, yes, there's a lot in the world to be angry about. There's a lot that's unfair in the world. And we should also be asking ourselves what gives us hope. Because if we don't have something that is inspiring or that gives us hope, we're going to be hard-pressed to stay invested in really hard work when we're hopeless. So I want you to turn to your neighbor and just share who you are. Maybe you know each other already, and that's great, but I suspect maybe you haven't answered the second question. So turn to each other and really just a minute each. It is quick. Tell one another who you are and what keeps you hopeful these days around racial equity and racial equality work. Go for it. I'll tell you when to switch partners. There's 2 pens. Switch partners. If you haven't switched yet, please switch partners. Another minute. All right. Finish your introductions with your partner. Come on back to the large group, please. Come on back, please. Come on back. All right. So I hope that for today, that each of us remembers one thing, whatever it was that you thought about that is inspiring, or that can keep us grounded, or can remind us that there's promise in doing hard work, that there's a good return for us, that there's something great happening, even if the world feels like a dumpster fire. I'll be honest, it feels a little like a dumpster fire to me these days. And that we are completely lost if we've lost some sense of hope. So I want you to hang on to that, and I want you to think about that moment of hope, or that beacon of hope that you have, that you shared with your partner, because there may be points in this conversation when we talk about something that makes you feel challenged, or that makes the world seem bleak. We may also talk about some things that you experience in very specific and micro ways in the museum and your interactions with young people that feel challenging and sad and hopeless, because you see something in what young people are experiencing with you and as they interact with the work that is a reflection of what's difficult in their own lives that we don't always know how to fix. So I want you to just hold on to that. And maybe I also want you to hold on to the fact that perhaps you learned something about somebody you work with that you didn't know before. That is also an invitation to recognize that there is so much we don't know about each other, even if you spend a lot of time together. So, all right. So I want to have us move through a bit before I give you a framework. The work today that I want to have us do, I want you to imagine it like I'm going to be offering you a pair of glasses. So I always say to people, I want to give you a tool. I think there are lots of people who do great teaching and who can tell folks all kinds of interesting content, teach you a bit about history, teach you about what's happening in contemporary situations around race and race equity or oppression. But oftentimes, even in a great conversation, folks can leave wondering, well, what the heck am I supposed to do with this now? Like, that was a great conversation, or wow, I learned something great, but I don't know what that means for me and the work that I'm supposed to do. I don't know what that means in my life. I don't know what that means in the conversation I should probably have with my cousin who's super racist, and we're gonna have dinner on Sunday, and I don't know what to do. Whatever it is, whatever the challenging opportunities are that are presenting themselves in our lives, my goal always is to give you a tool. So even though I'm going to be offering you something that I might academically call a framework, academically, I might refer to it as some kind of scaffolding for us to understand how race and race equity works and how power works and how it shapes us and our behaviors, not just the patrons who come in here, but also us who work inside the institution. I want you to imagine that what I'm going to give you, this framework, is really a pair of glasses that you can put on, and when you put them on, you will see something about yourself, your life, your work, this place, and how you work with the young people and the other patrons and visitors who come here, that it really is a tool to go in a toolbox. Because, what I didn't tell you is that while I've been doing training in race equity work for over 2 decades, I've been a community organizer for longer than that. And a community organizer is somebody who's always asking, how do we help people get a sense of their own power and to engage in something in such a way that it produces a different outcome? Like if you're going to build a house, or if you're going to build a different kind of house than the one that may not be, keeping you warm and dry, you need tools. You can't build a house without tools. And you can't figure out what tools you need unless you're doing really good diagnostics or a good diagnosis of what isn't working about the house you have now, and then imagining the house you want, and then making a plan to build something different. And you can't build anything if you don't have some kind of tools. So today, I want to give you a tool. So keep that in mind. Now, before we get into that, I want to offer some points of clarity. So I'm very clear that today we're going to be talking about equity. So I want to say, okay, so what exactly is equity? And why are we going to talk about equity? And how are we going to talk about it? So I want you to take a look at this. How many of you have seen this image or an image like this before? This image went viral on social media about 5 or 6 years ago. It's an image that has been used to really help people understand the difference between equality and equity. Because equality is not the same as equity. If you look on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see that there are 3 different size people all standing on the same size box trying to watch the same baseball game at a fence. That's equality. That means, well, we just gave everybody the same thing. But giving everybody the same thing does not actually mean that everybody will have access then. Because these 3 people are coming with different kinds of needs. So think about this historically. Different historical needs, different social needs, different cultural needs, whatever they are, whatever those needs are. In this illustration, they're shown by the size of the human being that's represented. Just because we give everybody the same thing doesn't mean that they're going to have access. I want you to hear that. The difference between equity and equality is that equity takes into account the starting place and the starting needs of a particular person or group of people. And then we give them what they need to be successful. Right? So I wouldn't give a group of people of color who've been historically marginalized, the same thing as I would for white people necessarily, who haven't necessarily been marginalized based on race. Now, we should factor in, okay, there's issues of class, there's all kinds of intersecting identities, but we can begin to see, oh, right, if we want people to be successful, we give them what they need based on their starting place. Now, this gets really confusing because I find, and check this out for yourself, that in lots of conversations, especially around race, we use equality and equity interchangeably. And sometimes we even throw in the word diversity. So we use diversity, equality, and equity interchangeably, but they don't mean the same thing. Even diversity, which is not up here, diversity just simply means a variety of things or people in a space. That doesn't even connote equality, much less equity. It just means a variety. So I don't think I'm telling any of you anything you don't already know, so I'm not making that presumption. But I am saying, in order for us to have the most effective, most fruitful conversation we can have today, I want to be very clear about what I mean so that you understand what I'm offering to you today. I'm not offering you a conversation on diversity today. I am not offering you a conversation on equality today. I'm offering you a conversation about equity today. So, and equity is what's going to help us understand why power matters. And when we start talking about race equity, it's going to be really clear why this image matters and why power matters there too. So are there any questions or also reactions to this image? Yeah, yes, we will make sure that there's a copy. We'll make sure. And I will also offer to you to sort of just trouble our structure of knowing about how the world is. There are some groups that have also toyed with adding a third panel, which is that there are 3 people standing watching a ball game and there is no fence. Right? Usually people are like, oh, mind blown, what? Now, I think for me, it's important to recognize that that's what Martin Luther King Jr. would have referred to as the beloved community. That's the vision of what it would mean to have all people have access, irrespective of our starting places and our needs, that everybody's needs are taken care of in order to have access. I'm also very clear that if we were to behave in the world now as if the fence didn't exist, it would be like putting on a pair of glasses I wouldn't want us to put on, which are rose-colored glasses, or to imagine that the world is somehow different. The world, I think many of us, we want the world to be, I don't think there's a single person in this world who wouldn't want the world to be more fair, who wouldn't want to wake up tomorrow and say, every form of inequity is gone. And we can love that image. But if we were to wake up tomorrow and live as if all inequity is gone, then we'd be hard-pressed to engage in the world as it is. So our task is to feel the tension of the vision of what we would love put up juxtaposed against what we know is real, which really is that like there needs to be some work done in our society around equity. And we'll make sure you get this. Awesome. So this is to expand just a little bit on what Jamie offered about sort of the rules of engagement for today. I like to offer people rules about how we'll be because, some people at least raised their hands and said, oh yeah, I was in a terrible conversation about race once, and maybe it broke relationships, whatever. So I'd like to offer you these basic ground rules, which are just that today we're going to explore and engage in the content. We're going to reflect and apply. The second half of our day, you're really going to be doing a lot of reflection and application as docents about how the stuff around race and race inequity shows up in the galleries and in your work. What I won't have us do is blame and shame each other for the construct and the context in which we live. And we won't avoid or derail the conversation. So I want us to really stick to it. Seem reasonable? And it's in line with a lot of what Jamie invited us to do too. So we'll do that. So the behavior I'm asking for is to respect each other, listen, share your own experience. That was important in what Jamie was saying. So I don't expect a single woman to speak for all women. I don't expect a black person to speak for all black people. I certainly don't speak for all Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I'm not asking any of us to do that. I'm asking you just to examine your own experience and then hold it next to other people's experiences, and then let's see what the story tells us. I want you to give and receive graciousness, to be good to each other. This conversation is not easy. There are lots of us as trainers who have tried to figure out how to, I was saying to David, make the conversation that most people have a significant amount of anxiety about, to make the conversation as disarming as possible so we can elevate the level of learning. But that doesn't mean that there won't be dis-ease. You might feel uneasy at points, and that's great, and that's okay. And then I would ask you to be as vulnerable as you can be, as you're willing to be. I'm not expecting you to leave your best friends. I'm not expecting you to cry for your neighbor. I'm not expecting any of that stuff. But I am asking you to do what I've seen makes this model of training and learning, this sort of learning, relearning, and then learning again, all this sort of, that's a pathway of learning and unlearning, that it works the best when people are willing to really be as vulnerable as possible and as honest about okay, this really shows up in my life this way. This really shows up in my work this way, and I'm going to work to articulate that and reflect on that. That makes it really, really useful. So as much as you're willing. All right? Okay, so that was a lot of front loading. So now I want to start digging into this framework. And I want to tell you a bit about the framework or the glasses that I want to give you to first help us talk about power in your life. And then we're going to move into a conversation about race. But this is the first step. So I have found that it's not easy to talk about power, and it's especially difficult to talk about oppression and how that works in society, especially when what I will tell you, and I think what most critical race theorists will tell you and sociologists will tell you, is that race is one of the things that deeply shapes us and our behaviors in society. And it doesn't require that we even know it's happening. So in fact, race and power and all kinds of other identities that we have in the world, and we'll talk about that, are constantly shaping how we interact with each other, how we interact with the world, how we interact with the places that we go to, institutions where we work, where we worship, where we do all kinds of recreation, whatever. That power and identity are constantly telling us how to do life, how to be in the world, and how to act. So I make jokes a lot about my therapist, but I love my therapist. Because what I want to be very transparent with you about is that this model of change that I offer people actually involves quite a bit of cognitive behavioral therapy. So if you know anything about cognitive behavioral therapy, this will probably look familiar. If you don't, what that means is I want to help us see what is the outcome that we're producing that feels unfair, inequitable, around race. And you could apply this to lots of other places in your life. But specifically today, we'll dig at race. If we can identify what's going awry, and then we can trace that back and say, what's the behavior that created this outcome? Am I exhibiting a particular behavior that is producing this outcome? Because if I can identify that, and I can hold the outcome against an outcome I would rather have, one that is equitable and just, then I can trace that back and say, oh, if I tried this behavior, it's a risky hypothesis, but if I try this behavior, and if I do this thing differently, then maybe I can produce a different outcome. In order, though, to do any of that, we need to see the lay of the land and how that even works. So I want to offer you the 30,000-foot view, and then we'll talk about, what are correlating behaviors that I was taught, that you were taught, based on your identities in society, one of which is race. So to do that, I want to share with you some of the learnings that I've gleaned from an activist, woman, academic, incredible person who's no longer alive, named Gloria Anzaldúa. Has anybody ever heard of Gloria Anzaldúa? Has anybody ever read a book? It's a collection of essays called This Bridge Called My Back. It was edited by Gloria Anzaldúa and Sherry Moraga, who are two Latinx feminists, activists. Gloria Anzaldúa was amazing. She died about 3 or 4 years ago. And I'll tell you a little bit about who she is, because this will help us understand the framework of the classes I'm giving you. Gloria Anzaldúa was a Chicana person. That means mixed race, somebody who's had heritage from the United States, white heritage, somebody who had heritage from Mexico. She grew up in the Southwest, and she really lived along the border of the Southwest. And this book that she wrote, called Borderlands La Frontera, is a book that has been pivotal for me and pivotal in my work, helping people understand power and positionality in society. And the thing with Gloria Anzaldúa is that, she was as radical as they come. She was one of the people who's credited with building and growing the Latina feminist movement, which was part of the womanist movement, which was very different than the feminist movement. And you may already start hearing me talk about how race impacts those things, that race kind of mattered because the feminist movement was not the same as the womanist movement for lots of reasons that had to do with race and globalism and colonialism. But Gloria Anzaldúa identified as lesbian and later politically as queer and later in her life. A person of color, identified as a woman, spoke Spanish but was also bilingual, and had built a whole identity, a radical identity around how she didn't fit in American society, how she didn't fit in the United States, because she wasn't a white guy, because she wasn't heterosexual, because she wasn't all of the things that we might very easily identify as like the norm in the United States. And so she imagined herself sort of on the margins of society, living this radical life. But then she started having some conversations with herself and with others, where she began to realize that, that is who I am. This is how I experience the world, and the world is unfair to me because of these things. But that isn't all that I am. Because I told you already, Gloria Anzaldúa was also an academic and a prolific writer, published with tenure. And she started to recognize that actually in her life, she actually had a significant amount of power. Because she could go to university. She could get an advanced degree. She recognized that even though she identified as Latinx and Chicana and had family members who did not speak English, she did. And that gave her access. And that gave her power. And she began to look at all of the things that actually gave her power, and she saw herself mapped in such a way where she wasn't just on the borders or the margins of society, but she also had an incredible amount of power just in her own life. Just in her own life. This is not some theory. And so she started writing about it and talked about that in the Borderlands, in this book. Because what she saw was that, oh, wait, in the United States, we learn how to do power based on the identities that we have. I want you to hear this. Based on the identities that we have that put us in the middle of society. She imagined it as like, oh, like there's the center of society, and that's where we do power and access. And there are certain ways of being, certain identities you can get that put you closer to that or all the way in that. Or other identities that you have that put you on the outside, and you have less access and less institutional or systemic power. So I share this with you because I've also had a bit of an interesting encounter experience in my own life with a friend when I was doing anti-racism work in my 20s. And, you know, unlike all their 20s, I was like the know-it-all and brash and loud and thought I knew everything. It's very unusual to be like that in your 20s, isn't it? And I was a student organizer on a college campus, and I was doing racial equity work with a mixed race group of people. I had lots of friends of color, and we were doing all this radical work. And after this big event that we had done, which was like very loud, it just was a highly confrontational action on our campus to raise some issues around race equity and inequity on campus. We did this. We were in this room, and we were debriefing at this house with our friends, and it was the end of the year. It was like sort of our last big protest on campus that we were doing. It was graduation, and everybody was sort of getting ready to go, and people started peeling away from the meeting. And at the end, I was left there with my friend Chiedza. Chiedza is black, and Chiedza is from Zimbabwe. She's an international student. We did a lot of work together, and we were really, really good friends. And she said, you know, I'm really glad that you're here because I want to talk to you about something that I've just been thinking about around the organizing that we're doing and about our relationship and how to make it stronger. And I thought, oh, great. All right. Like, and I was also that like really eager, annoying young person who was like, oh, yes, it's summer. We're going to get ready for the fall. We're going to do all these things. And that was my own identity. And she sat me down and she said, you know, I want to just be clear with you about some things that I'm experiencing with you that I'm finding really difficult. And I started like, you know, you get that feeling when you start to be like, oh, I'm slightly uncomfortable. Like, we're going to have a conversation I didn't think we were going to have. Or like when a friend or a family member or your partner says, hey, we need to talk. And you're like, oh, shit, we need to talk. About what? Sorry, I totally swore. I've been trying to contain it. I told you I was a very casual trainer. So I started having this, like my ears were getting hot, my palms were getting sweaty, and she had just said, you know, there's some stuff that I think you should know about that I've been experiencing, and it's made things really hard for me. And I was like, okay, what? She said, you know, I just want you to think about that there's some ways that you interact here in the work that we're doing that make it really hard for me. So when we're planning actions, you don't even realize how gendered you are in the way that you like assign work. Because I was one of the lead organizers on campus doing this student organizing stuff. And she said, you know, the way that you assign labor is very gendered. And I was like, oh, okay. And then she said, and when you think about the things we should be doing, you want to do the loudest, most brash, most in-your-face action or tactic. And that's not safe for me. And you never think about what that's like for me because I'm an international student. And if I get kicked off campus, I don't just get kicked off campus, I leave the country. And your family is like 2 miles away. So you don't ever think about that. And that hurts me. And she said, you know, and you don't think about like the enormous amount of privilege that you have as an Asian American. She's like, compared to me, I'm black. Like you may very well experience all kinds of stuff around white supremacy and racism, but you don't think about what's different and how you have access that I don't have. And she started going through this list, and I would say that I was not particularly generous in receiving what she was saying, because my verbatim response was, what are you talking about? You don't even know me. This tells me you have no idea who I am. Because I reacted in such a way where I said, you don't know me. My family came here as refugees. We were poor. We had swastika spray painted on our house. We had no food. We were like so poor. We were like government cheese, people dropping food off on our porch poor. Like you have no idea what I've been through. All of which was true in my life experience, and which made it very hard for us to have a much deeper conversation where she was pointing out to me my own center borderlands place. In all the ways in which I, like Gloria Anzaldúa, had built my life as like the radical outsider who actually had a whole lot of access on the inside. And the truth is, for most groups, especially groups that are left-leaning or people who imagine ourselves as the good ones, that's true for all of us. And so to have this conversation, in order to talk about power, remember I said, okay, we're stitching power through here. The first thing I need us to do is to say, where is power in your life? We can have some theoretical conversation about the power of the institution here at the Nelson Atkins, or the power of, how power is wielded in the sector and in museums. We can have that big conversation, but it's not particularly useful unless each of us is saying, how does power show up? Because because I propose to you, if we learn how to do power, and if we learn how to do identities in society in such a way that teaches us behaviors that produce a particular outcome, then I first have to ask myself, am I exhibiting behaviors that are producing a particular outcome? Whether or not I like it, whether or not I gave permission for somebody to teach me how to do that. It does not mean that you are a good or bad person if you have learned socialized behavior that supports a construct of inequity. I want you to hear that very clearly. I'm not here to have a conversation about who's good and who's bad. I'm here to have what I would call an ontological conversation. That means let us look and see what we see, and then figure out, do I fit into the landscape? And then what does that tell me about myself and about us and about what we do? This is not about blaming and shaming. Because I don't think that I'm a horrible human being because I learned some pretty bad behavior from society. But I'm responsible for the behavior that I exhibit. And I'm responsible for knowing how that got into me. And I would propose that's true for all of us. So I want us to dig at this for a minute. So Gloria Anzaldúa, her book, Borderlands, La Frontera, really is, if you could just close your eyes and imagine, I sometimes draw this up on a flip chart, and I don't have it here, but if you could just imagine, there's like a swirling red center. It's like tornadic in the middle of a giant piece of paper. It's vast whiteness. And in the center is this swirling red center. That's the center of society, and that's where power exists, in the middle. And depending upon your identity, you have greater or lesser access to that pool or that bucket of power. So I want you to just imagine. And then on the outside, surrounding that is like a wild forest. Mountains, oceans, trees, a vast, vast forest where lots of other people are. And that's the borderlands, where if you don't actually have an identity that puts you near or in the center, you exist somewhere in the borderlands. Now, this is where it's important to recognize that your identity is what gives you access or power. It's not just like, oh, I woke up and, one day I just fell out of a tree and suddenly I had power or didn't have power. That society gives you something in exchange for an identity you have. So identities are like when you can say, I am a refugee. I am a woman. I am a cisgendered heterosexual woman. I am middle income and increasingly middle class. I am. All of the I am statements you can make are good indicators of who you are and your identity. Identities are given to us in many, many ways in society. So I want you to hear that. Again, like I didn't wake up and decide, or I should say I wasn't born and then decided I was going to be given the identity of girl. Somebody else did that to me, and the institutions did that to me. I also lived into it and then learned all the behaviors that come with being a girl in society. Do you hear what I'm saying? Just like I wasn't born and then was Asian American. Society gave me that identity and then gave me all kinds of rules around access or lack of access, some power or no power, depending on that identity. It is not about choice. I'll tell you what, because I know that if I wake up tomorrow and look at myself in the mirror and say, today I'm white, the world will remind me that I'm not. So that's a good way to just see how it works. It's not just about personal choice. So identities are what give us access. So you'll see here, there's a lot of text on this slide. I promise this is the text with the most slide, or the most text on any slide that I have here. But just think about identities that put you in the center, that put people in the center. In our society, it has to do with whiteness, maleness, heterosexuality, being cisgender. That means that the gender you were assigned at birth, that your outward projecting gender matches that, right? So there's stuff around gender and being cisgender, being documented, or being a citizen, being English proficient, Protestant Christian, and we could trouble that a little bit after JFK was elected when Catholics sort of were able to sneak in there. Being able-bodied, middle to upper class, educated, and traditionally educated, middle-aged, embodying a certain standard of beauty. Like you can start to see, oh, those are identities. It doesn't, again, I say very clearly, it doesn't mean you are a bad person if you have those identities. It means those identities give you access because we live in a society designed around power and access. And then if you're on the outside, you're outside of what we call the norm. So how we normalize identities and normalize behaviors and then normalize and centralize the power that comes with certain identities is all about how we do life in the United States. And it shows up everywhere, everywhere. So I was teasing a little bit earlier, not teasing like as in joking, but pulling out, that in this country, and I think in a room like this where there are a lot of people who I think identify as women, it's really important to recognize that there's a real difference between what happened with the feminist movement and what happened with the womanist movement. That what I have learned around modern feminism is that modern feminism was primarily designed for white women. That it was a movement for white women to say, we have a right to earning power. We have a right to not be tethered at home. We have a right to work. We have a right to enter the workforce. But what that meant was women of color were like, we've been working for generations. We would really like to stay home with our own children. We would really like to stay home instead of caring for the white children whose white feminist moms are now going to go out and join this movement. I don't say that to be snarky. I say that because it's real. And that's what spawned an entire other movement of primarily women of color that was the womanist movement. Because what we discovered was that in the feminist movement in the United States, women were unwilling to talk about whiteness and how that shaped what people were experiencing, because this is the intersecting stuff. So yes, absolutely, white women get less than white men. Absolutely. And white women, because of race, get more than women of color. It doesn't make white women bad. It doesn't make white feminists bad. I'm just trying to say, what do we see here? There's a story here for us to tell about power and access. And it's sometimes uncomfortable. And it may be sometimes what we don't want to talk about, because remember, nobody really likes power. Like lots of people are already raising their hands about how that's uncomfortable to talk about power and whether or not you have it. But I would hazard to propose to you that power is actually a really good thing. Power is a good thing. And quite honestly, I wish more of us had it. I don't want the kind of power that hurts people, but I think that helps us see that, power when wielded irresponsibly can really do damage. But I'll tell you what, if we had the power to make things fairer for women, if we have the power to make things fairer for immigrants, if we had the power to get children out of cages along the border, I want that power. I would really like that power. So when I said earlier, we need to resolve our feelings about power as something different from whether or not we should have more of it. But to have more of it, or to recognize the places where there are deficits, we also have to say, okay, I have power that other people don't have. And I need to be able to talk about that. Because I'm really aware that in this construct, I am somebody who is in the borderlands in lots of ways, with all of my identities. And I speak English, which puts me close to the center. I'm heterosexual, married to another heterosexual person who is cisgendered. That puts me, and I'm even more in the middle because my husband is white. It puts me even closer because of his whiteness. And my proximity to his whiteness puts me a lot closer. I'm very aware that even as an Asian American, I'm out in the borderlands, but not nearly out as far as indigenous people or black people. And I have to own that, because that's just real. Because that's how this is structured. because then that gives me the ability to talk about that and to process it, and then to say, oh, these are the behaviors that I learned. Because if we can't identify the behaviors, we're still going to do them. All of the power and privilege will ooze out. I just will pretend it doesn't. Or I'll pretend I don't have it, and then it will ooze out, and I'll have to have a conversation like I did with my friend Chiedza and deal with the fact that somebody else will point out how my power and privilege is oozing out. So, and finally, I'm going to have you go to your, turn to each other and talk a little bit, but the final thing I want to really be clear with all of you about is that this isn't just theory. This is real stuff. So the example that I think is very poignant that I try to use in trainings is I say to folks, okay, so I can recognize everything I've already told you about myself, cisgender, heterosexual, married to another cisgender, heterosexual, a white guy. All of those things are real in my life. What that means is if my husband gets sick and goes into the hospital and is going to die, I can sit with him and hold his hand while he dies. That's a privilege. Because I have friends who are gay, lesbian, bi, trans, queer, who cannot marry their spouses, and if their spouses die, they can't be with them. They are not allowed to be next to them when the person they love the most dies. That's a systemic and institutional privilege. When my children were born, neither my husband nor I had to adopt them. I have friends who are gay, bi, trans, lesbian, queer, who have had to adopt their own children because the system is set up this way. So I want you to hear there's real tangible return. Even as somebody who has lots of Borderlands identity, I have a lot of access in other ways, and it gives me something. And if I can't name that, usually what will happen is I'll just universalize my experience and say, well, of course everybody gets to be with their spouse when they die, because I can. Or even worse, if somebody says, that's not my experience, I might actually counter by saying, well, my experience is this, and so, therefore, your experience of being marginalized probably isn't real, or maybe I'll question you about it, maybe even gaslight you a little bit about whether or not that's real, because my experience, which is the universalized status quo, it tells me that that couldn't possibly be true. So I offer this to you as a very deep dive into what this looks like. So what I want you to do now, I told you, I'm going to ask you to meddle. Because I'm pretty sure that it's very difficult to have the institutional level conversations we want to have about power and access and centered identities and how centered identities shape institutional life, because they do. It's very hard to have that conversation if I cannot have the conversation for myself first. The self in the community, in the institution, is how that works. It's like a matryoshka, it's like nesting dolls. This is how it works if we want to be as effective as possible. So I want you to pause for a minute and think about the construct that I just offered you, the center of the Borderlands, and ask yourself 2 questions, and they're on 2 different sides, but I'm going to have you talk about this. The first question to turn to your neighbor is to ask yourself, what identities put you in the center or near the center? You don't have to be smack in the center. In fact, there aren't that many of us who are right smack in the center. But what identities give you access to the center in some way? So think about that. Could be race, could be education, could be class, geography, age, ability, whatever it is. Think about that. Analyze the power that you have. And then the other thing I'm going to have you talk about too is what identities locate you in the Borderlands. Everybody, all of us, have identities that give us access and identities that push us out. I've not met a single person who only has centered identities or who only has Borderlands identities. So I want you to ask yourself, what identities put me in the center and what identities put me in the Borderlands? The most critical thing I want you to do as you analyze this, put this in the bucket. Can you name, as you think about your centered identities, can you name power and privilege that you get? benefits that you get. If it's helpful for you to think, oh, I get this benefit, or I get this privilege. It's not that you asked for it. It's not that you have to like it. It has nothing to do with that. Do you get it? Do you get it? And then, and if you have enough spaciousness to think about it, I would love for you to also tease out, wow, what happens when your border identities and your center identities clash against each other? Because they do all the time. What happens? What happens? So it's a full, there are several parts to this question, and I recognize they're on two different sides, but I just decided right now to put them together and to give you a little bit more time. So to the best of your ability, turn to your neighbor. I would really love for you to stay in dyads. I know that sometimes there's an inclination to just turn to 3, and I want you to try to fight that unless there's we really have an odd number, and if we do, then there's only one group of 3. But I want you to maximize your conversations with each other. So if you need to shift around a little bit, please do. Again, what identities put you in the center, and what privileges do you get? What identities put you in the borderlands? And what happens when your identities smash up against each other? I'll give you about 7 minutes. Go for it. If you haven't switched partners yet, please do. Please switch partners if you haven't done so already. Melody? Yeah. Hey, Mallory, could you turn the handheld mic on, please? All right, folks. Like you to wrap up your small group conversations, please. Come on back to the large group, please. Come on back. So, as much as I would love to have a big debrief of what happened, we just can't do that with time and sort of the way the space is set up. But I would like to invite a couple of people who, if you want to share and are willing to just give us a taste of your reflections. I would ask that you not share all the stuff that other people shared in your pair or your group, because we haven't asked for permission. But just for yourself, how was this conversation? What did you reflect on? And how did it go for you? Just a couple sentences from anybody who wants to give us a taste.
Can I have a mic who wants to speak?
Yes, and David will come with a mic. Awesome, because I was starting to think maybe you were only talking about the snowstorm. Trying to assess whether or not you did what I asked you to do.
Basically, I'm a copious note taker, so I just said, that I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm heterosexual, cisgender, born, bred in the United States, proficient, English proficient. I have an advanced degree, etc. And those things definitely give me, and particularly as I've grown older, I've been more and more aware of the power that that affords me. One small, tiny little thing that kind of made me aware of my privileges. I was telling them I like to speed in my car, and so my husband finally said, I'm like, but I don't get tickets. And he's like, that's right, because you're white, you're a woman, and you're middle class. And I was like, you're right. I know, no, I'm not broadcasting that, so don't give me, but he's like, and so I look a lot of times, and the people that are pulled over are usually male, black, or female black. I mean, they have a tendency, particularly in Kansas City, Missouri. So there's a little tiny taste of, being towards that center. Now, the things that put me on the borderland is, I've never admitted this to a crowd, but I'm an atheist, and I'm actually a pretty firm atheist, and particularly here in the Midwest, that's like, they're actually lower than Muslims, so, which is saying, and there's a lot of fear in this country, around that. So, anyway, and I'm female, and I'm middle-aged, and we were actually kind of talking about that as women grow older, I become less visible. And the opinions that I express, and et cetera, become less listened to, or I feel they are not listened to as much.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. If I may, I just want to, I appreciate you sharing that, because it's a very personal thing that I've asked people to share. And if I may, just pause for a minute. I just want to offer a point of reflection on something that you shared. I'm not an atheist, but I'm a secular humanist who grew up in a very, very, very conservative evangelical community. And so I recognize what that means in the Midwest. To not identify as a Christian in the Midwest is very powerful. I will say that I would invite us to wonder the way that we've racialized Islam and racialized Muslim people, whether or not being a secular humanist or an atheist is actually harder than being Muslim. Not to deny your experience or what it means to not be Christian, but just to be like, oh, we should think about that. Because maybe that's not the case. And maybe that's something for us to think about because we have racialized an entire religion. Because there are plenty of white people who are Muslim. And there are non-black people of color who are Muslim. But we have, people who are not Middle Eastern who are Muslim. But we've done something funky around how we've racialized an entire religion. So just, like lots of layers to the onion to peel. But thank you, and thank you for offering your experience. Anybody else want to share? Center or Borderlands identity? You don't have to. Okay, awesome, thank you. So I want to have us do a little bit of thinking, because remember I said, the way that I want to offer you this pair of glasses to start to see it, I wear contact lenses and glasses, and sometimes it takes a little time to get used to the prescription. And sometimes things look different when you've got your glasses on and something's close or something's far away. That the same analysis that I've just asked you to apply to yourself and your own life around the center and borderlands, I want you to also now think about in terms of this institution, the Nelson. Because institutions are made up of people. It's not like institutions are some cold, heartless place that somehow managed to function when nobody shows up, because we know that's not how institutions work. So all of us bring whatever we bring to the institution, all of what we choose to talk about or don't talk about around our centered identities and the power and access that they give us. In the same way that lots of institutions that don't have spaciousness for people to talk about their power and identities, also very rarely have space for people to talk about their marginalized identities too. So I want to have us sort of expand the funnel, right? So the invitation was to think about yourself, but then to think about, well, then how does this analysis work in institutional life? How do organizations and institutions repeat the values of the center, regurgitate and reproduce the values of the center in everything that we do, oftentimes without our knowing? It does not require our consciousness, and in fact, it works best if we are not conscious of it. And what does that mean for people and experiences that folks have when they come to us, both inside and outside of the institution, who are experiencing something around the borderlands? Because generally speaking, I put this slide up here because oppression works like it's a moving escalator, or it's a moving walkway. So I don't know if you've ever been on one of these. I'm a business traveler, and I fly a lot, so I'm on these all the time. And there's inevitably always the person who is standing on the side, just kind of going with it. There's always the person who's running on the moving walkway because they're trying to get to the end. And then, probably 50% of the time I see a child running on it, but they're running the opposite direction. So there's those kinds of people on the moving walkway. So if you imagine this moving walkway as the walkway of oppression in society, oppression, the way that we built it, we've done it for generations now. We have institutionalized it. We did it in the founding of this country, and we could do a whole other training about how we institutionalized oppression and how we institutionalized something like racism when we colonized this land and killed thousands, hundreds of thousands of indigenous people. We can talk about how we built it into our institutions by creating a form of slavery that only existed here in the United States, which was chattel slavery. There was slavery in other parts of the world, but those people were still considered human beings. Some kind of a less than human being. But in the United States, human beings were turned into animals and property. That's a very different kind of slavery that we did here. And we stole people from African nations and brought them here and forced them to become chattel slaves. That's built into the DNA of who we are as a country. So we didn't just come here today to have a conversation about, well, maybe there's some stuff around inequity and racial inequity and some challenges around racism at the Nelson Atkins. When our patrons come, when we show up as people who work and volunteer here, like this is, imagine like we're a domino that fell at the end of a very long trail of dominoes that just were tipped a long time ago, and then you just watch the pathway of falling and all the dominoes knock each other down. To me, it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise that any institution would discover that there's racism here. Because we were created in a country that was totally designed and built upon racism, colonialism, and white supremacy culture. And so when I say white supremacy, I don't literally just mean people who burned crosses and wore white pointy hoods. That's part of it. But if we're going to understand racism now, we have to understand it as something much bigger than just white pointy hats and burning crosses. We have to understand that it's not about intention anymore. And in a place like this, we can be well-intentioned people behaving together in an institution that produces racist outcomes. I want you to really think about that. Yes, we should be changing people's hearts and minds. That's important. All of us have our own deprogramming and unlearning and relearning to do. But if we think that's the only solution, the moving walkway of oppression is just going to keep going. Because I can change my heart and mind, but that doesn't change the way the system is working. It's like I said to you, we could excise the 1 or 2 or 5 or 20 or 500 racists from an institution, but the system is still going the way it is. So our sister can talk about her experience here about being middle-aged, white, and being able to speed in a car, which kind of seems funny, but when we think about what the cost is on communities of color, particularly on Black and Latinx people, and how people experience the police, systemically, that's what we're talking about. It has nothing to do with whether or not I'm a good person, or I'm a nice person, or I'm working on my own stuff. So we have to see the connection here. And we need to understand that when we talk about what's happening here, there's a normal here at the Nelson Atkins too. There's a normal in how you all work and like how this industry and how this sector is structured. There's a normal to how we understand art. There's a normal to how we understand how we exhibit and show art. There's a normal to how we do everything in this institution. Right? That the centered identities shape what is acceptable. And they very clearly shape what's unacceptable. In the way we talk, in the way we act, in the way we dress, in the way we present ourselves, in the way we create policies and programs and procedures. All of that stuff is about power. So I want you to think about that and to just chew on these questions. I'm not going to have us do a lot of deep diving here because this is the beginning of a conversation. But if you were to take those glasses, put them on, I ask you to put them on and spend a lot of time looking at yourself. Now, those center borderlands glasses, I'm asking you to look at the Nelson Atkins. What's normal here? Around gender, around race, around class, around access and power. Because that will start to give you some grist, some sort of, I said 30,000-foot view that helps you see actually at a macro level what's happening to shape at the micro level what you're experiencing. So for docents, when you find yourself at a painting with a group of young people and you don't know how to interact with those young people, or those young people don't know how to interact with you, or one young person says something really inappropriate, right? Like, okay, we have to say, what does this tell us about this whole industry? What does this tell us about what that young person has learned? What does it tell us about what that young person learned on this moving walkway? What does it tell me about what I learned on that moving walkway? Because if I can see those things, then I might be able to say, all right, like maybe this is an intervention. Or maybe I'll see that there's a place where I don't have to run away from the discomfort of that, because I can understand why the discomfort is there. I am not afraid of the discomfort because I can talk about power, and I can name it, and I can name how it shows up here. Not just in my life, but here. So this is what I want to have you chew on. In a moment, we're going to take a break. But remember we said we want to dig into race this afternoon. And we're going to do some real hands-on looking at the data and the responses that you gave to David in the survey, and to help you think through all of that, just with everything we've talked about today. But before we take a break, you've probably figured out, I'm big on definitions and making sure we're real clear. When we say this, we mean this, at least to be as effective as possible, so we're not talking past each other. But I'll tell you what, we live in a country that's ruled by race, and we don't have a common definition of what it is. So I want you to literally just talk to me in this auditorium. When you hear the word racism, tell me how you define it. Just speak into the room. It's about color. What else? Institutional bias. What else? Prejudice. Judgment. What else? Social class. Scapegoating. Privilege. Culture. What other things? There's economic inequity. There's certainly economic impacts for sure. What else? Snap judgments. Stereotypes. Fear. Fear usually gets in the room. So this is just a super quick exercise to illustrate to you all. And I do this exercise a lot. I have taught a lot of trainers how to do this exercise. I have been in a lot of rooms over 2 decades asking the same question. And what is clear to me every single time is that there are as many definitions of racism as there are people in a room. So we could say, okay, well, that's great. Multiplicity, sure, great. That's a great postmodern thing to want to do. But if we were saying, hey, we need to get together because there's a problem in this place, wherever this place is. There's an issue here at the Nelson Atkins around race. We don't quite know how to describe it. We're having experiences that are unnerving, uncomfortable. White people are experiencing some things this way. People of color are experiencing this way. Patrons are experiencing this. Whatever it is, racism's a thing. Clearly it's a thing because we got together to talk about it. If we have, in a room of 100 people, 100 different diagnoses, how easy will it be, or how effective will we be in deciding how we're going to treat this thing? We're going to have 100 different approaches to suit every single person? We'd be hard-pressed to do that. What I want to indicate to you all is that, okay, if diagnosis determines treatment, then we have to be clear on what our diagnosis is. And we have to have some sense of agreement around the diagnosis. It doesn't mean we agree on every single nitty-gritty detail, but enough that we are at least not going to talk past each other. Enough that we can say, okay, we need some parameters to the conversation, because otherwise we just won't be effective. So remember, we started with the borderlands, we talked about power, and you'll hear me as we're making the transition to just really pull out race as one identity. I'm not saying race is the only identity anybody brings in here. That would be silly, because we bring a multiplicity of identities. We bring just a panacea of life experiences from lots of different things. And what I also notice in this country is that race is usually the thing people don't want to talk about. We'll talk about gender, we'll talk about sexism, we'll talk about class, we'll talk about nationalism. We might even get out there and talk about militarism, but we won't talk about racism. So what I want us to do is say, okay, of all the identities that shape us and our experiences in the borderlands in the center, race is one of those things. So let's talk about it. But in order to talk about it, we need a common definition, because it's clear we don't have one. It's also really clear when I hear people giving feedback. When I ask the question, "How do you define racism?" I generally hear 2 kinds of responses. One is the kind of individual response, it's a personal prejudice or it's a bias, or some people might say. Sometimes I hear the word hate. All the things that I control, that I can change as an individual. But then I also hear other things, like somebody was talking about, there's institutional power. There's something else systemic happening. right? I made that clear already. Even if I changed my biases, it doesn't change the fact that black men are being stopped by the police, and it doesn't matter how rich they are. No officer who stops somebody for driving while black is going to first say, can you show me your tax returns, and then I'll decide whether or not I'm going to let you go. That actually isn't how it works. So I want us to just see that there's these two things, these two components. So racism is clearly not just individual prejudice. It's bigger than that. But it needs to have this thing called power. There's something about power here. So I want to offer this definition to you that can encompass all of this. That when we think about racism, it's race prejudice plus the misuse of systemic or institutional power. That's what creates racism. Now let me pause for a minute and say, everybody can be racially prejudiced. It's an equal opportunity illness, so thumbs up for that. Right? You can't live in the United States and not somehow be shaped by racial narratives about your own racial group, about other people. It's not possible. Also, prejudice is just to prejudge something. So even a racial prejudice isn't in and itself inherently negative or bad. So what I mean is, when I look at history and I think about activists in the 60s and 70s, activists of color carrying signs that say black power, right? Or red power, or yellow power, or all these people. I don't think that, that's a bias, or black is beautiful. That's a racial prejudice, but it's not bad. It doesn't hurt me. In fact, I think that is, in the race construct, profoundly good. Right? So you can have any number of prejudices, but you could also have prejudices that are actually really mean-spirited and hurtful. I believe that Asian Americans and Asians should rule the world. And I'll tell you what, there are plenty of Asians in the world building empire and doing all kinds of horrible things all over the world that also really believe that. But in the United States, let's say I believe that. It's not racism unless the institutions and systems of the society we live in force everybody else to live by those racial biases. It doesn't mean I'm not racially prejudiced. I can have racial prejudices about white people and other people of color, about myself and people who look like me. But unless my society makes everybody live by those rules, it's not racism. It's not the same. So I want to offer this to you all as a much bigger sandbox. Right? This is where if we create a sandbox like this, then we see it isn't just about whether or not you're running through South Carolina carrying a tiki torch. It's not about whether or not you have a racist bone in your body, although I always tell people bones aren't racist, so I don't know what argument you're trying to make. Bones aren't racist, but the inclination to want to remove myself from a construct that is clearly not good. The inclination to do that, I think, is a human inclination, because I don't want to be a bad person. But when I do that, I abdicate the responsibility I actually have for fixing something much bigger than just whether or not my attitudes and actions are good ones. That's the sandbox. If any of you have ever read anything by Robin DiAngelo, thumbs up to you for doing that. If you haven't, you should. Robin DiAngelo, last name is spelled capital D-I, capital A-N-G-E-L-O. Robin DiAngelo is a white woman who has written and talked about and has done incredible thought leadership amongst white people about whiteness, and particularly with white women, around the fragility that comes, or the defensiveness that comes with white women in particular, talking about race. She's phenomenal. She's really, really phenomenal. She often talks about how we are at a place right now in society where all of us, and she invites white people in particular as a white person, to understand that racism is more than intention. It's more than overt malicious behavior. Yes, it is that, and it is not only that. And in order for us to see that and to ask ourselves how it's playing out here at the Nelson Atkins, I'm offering you this sandbox. I'm offering and inviting you to come and look at it here. Because I don't think that there are docents here who go home and, want to do the most horrible thing. I don't really believe that there are docents or staff people going here and terrorizing people of color in their communities. I don't believe it. Maybe, I don't know, because I don't know everybody. But certainly this group in this room, you've come here and you've hung out with me long enough. I have a feeling that probably none of you do that. So we're technically the good ones. But the good ones in this construct, we're not somehow outside of this. We're not somehow outside of racism. And so this is the invitation to think bigger about it. So I want to leave this here, but I do want to just take a moment before we take a break to ask other questions, other insights, a light bulb moment, or something that you want to clarify before we take a break about this definition. You'll see that power is really important in this definition. Okay. Totally fine if there isn't. Let's take a stretch. Can we do a 10-minute break? Let's take a 10-minute break. Please stretch. You let me talk at you for a long time. Thank you for that. Take a 10-minute stretch break. Please come back here at 2:50 because we're going to be digging into what docents are really experiencing and trying to put the glasses on and talk about it and maybe talk about some interventions. So 2:50, please come back.
Okay, so that was a wonderful start. And what we're going to do for the second part of this training now is think about this in the context of what's going on in the galleries. As most of you know, I sent out a survey about a month ago to get your take on problems or concerns that you're experiencing in the galleries in relationship to race. We got a great response, a better response than I actually anticipated. And what we did for this presentation is take those comments, look at them overall, and put them in buckets so we can talk about them. So for example, one of the categories is uncomfortable in talking about racial history with young audiences. So we tried to kind of group these comments. We have about 6 buckets to talk about. I think we'll hopefully get a chance to talk about as many of these as possible before 4. So, and how this will work is we'll flash the actual statements up. You'll read them. I don't think you need help reading them. And then Paku will initiate a conversation with your group about these concerns or circumstances that have happened in the galleries. How does that sound? So Paku will lead the conversation. I'll be around with a mic so we make sure we get this all on the recording. Make sure we all get it taped, okay? Does that sound good? Okay, Paku.
All right, we will do as much as we can. I don't think that we'll be able to get through all 6 categories or the 6 buckets in the next hour. But I want to tell you why, when David and other folks and I were planning this, that we thought it would be good for you all to just sort of use your own feedback and your own experiences as your incubator for the conversation. Is because I think this is an opportunity for you as a group to develop some muscles together. You know, I think applying an analysis or putting on the glasses together and talking about what you see without shame, without blame, like that's not the point of the conversation, but to say what are we experiencing as docents? What do we think our visitors are experiencing? You might discover that actually there's a lot of your experience that's making it very difficult to engage with the visitors, what you might be struggling with or what you don't know how to talk about maybe your own centered identities, or there's so much here. But the whole point of the next hour is to really just give you the chance to practice that together. So it doesn't matter necessarily that we get through all 6. Maybe we'll get through 3. But the whole purpose is to help you as a group develop a discipline that might be new. I don't presume, I want to say this very openly, I don't presume that all of you are in the same place around your desire to have this conversation, around your agreement to have this conversation, around your enthusiasm. I don't hold that as the same. Some of you may be like just ready to jump into the deep end and figure out how to swim around in this stuff, and some of you might be more cautious, all of which is okay. The entire breadth of the experience is okay, because I don't expect that every one of you has the same understanding of, how you want this to go. I think that in a room like this, there's lots of varying levels of what we understand historically. That's not a judgmental statement. It is. You may have been able to tell that, like, I'm somebody who just wants to know what is real, because then we can work with what is without judgment. And so that will impact how you want to engage, how you as a group will learn. I will say very, very clearly that, like, one of the things that I think was important for me to learn is that with 30 Americans coming, there are some docents who are anxious about that because of all of this stuff, because of the not knowing, or because of the lack of clarity, or because of a personal discomfort, whatever that is. And that there are some docents who are totally ready, and, like, there's a team of folks who want to get as much information and do as much of their own self-interrogation as possible in order to lead visitors through that. The entire spectrum is okay. I'm also telling you the entire spectrum is what you'll need to hold as you together as a group move through and develop some discipline around this that incorporates care and generosity about the different places where you are. So I just think it's important to say that explicitly. Nobody's starting from the exact same place, and that's all right. So let me tell you, when I looked at the data, and David shared it with me, the 6 buckets that emerged, before we go through them slide by slide, because there actually isn't one slide in the deck that shows them all listed, the 6 buckets are as follows. There was a lot of feedback about white guilt. Docents who are white feeling guilty. This is not white guilt from patrons. There was a good amount of feedback about that, and just people being self-reflective and wanting to have some conversation about what do we do about this. So white guilt was one of the buckets. Another one was talking about race history with young audiences. So that includes folks who are like, I don't know enough. Like, how do I know enough? And how do I talk about lynching with young people and the history of that and the trauma? Like, it includes all of those kinds of conversations. The third bucket was how conversations at pieces of artwork can be really emotionally triggering. So what do we do when stories trigger emotions, sadness or grief, or maybe anger? And I would invite us to think about, like, it triggers emotion not just for the visitor, but also for docents. So that's the third bucket. The fourth bucket was also just in general not knowing enough. So there's stuff about not knowing. The second bucket was not knowing enough about race history to talk with young people. But there's a bigger bucket of people feeling like, I just don't even know enough about race to talk about it in general, for myself or for somebody else. The fifth bucket was, what do we do when there are inappropriate statements? What do we do when a child says something inappropriate? Is it, because what we know is this is learner and visitor led, how much do we teach? Do we redirect? Are we supposed to? What am I supposed to do? What if I don't know enough to redirect, right? Like, you can hear, like, the increasing levels of anxiety, which I want to just hold and honor, that when I was reading the data, I could feel that, and people trying to figure out what to do and how to navigate that space. And then the sixth bucket was, what do we do when children don't respond? What do we do with silence? Because silence can be really unnerving. And in silence, there's usually a story that people don't know how to tell or won't tell around race. So those are the 6 big buckets. I'd like to have us try to get through. I took the liberty as the facilitator, because this is the power that I have. I'm just telling you transparently. Know thyself and know your power. I would like us to try to get through 3, and I want to prioritize those 3 buckets. The first is I want to have us have a conversation about white guilt among docents. I want us to talk about what do we do when something is emotional and is triggering emotionally for the viewer and for the docents as well, for you all. And then the other thing I want to do, the other bucket I want to make sure we try to get to is, what do we do about not knowing enough? When I feel like I don't know enough to have a substantive conversation with a visitor, you might even discover, like, maybe even with your peers, what does that mean? What does it feel like? What do we do? So the structure for the conversation is very simple. My bias for group conversation is always KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Just keep it simple. Things don't have to be more complicated than they already are. We are talking about a complicated challenge as it is. So to build the muscle, I want to keep it simple. So we'll show the slides and give you a sense of what the feedback is around the 3 prioritized buckets of conversation. And then I'm just going to ask you, talk to each other about what that feels like. What happens around something like white guilt when you're on the floor, when you're in the galleries? What do you see? Maybe you're somebody who didn't respond that way and you don't feel any white guilt, and so there's an opportunity to learn from a partner or somebody in your group who wants to and is willing and vulnerable enough to talk about that. So we'll do that in small groups, and then we'll do some, as much as we can, sort of open conversation. I'm actually going to come off the stage and come down to try to facilitate that a little bit better. And then we'll talk about, so then what? Then what? What could we try differently? What might you need? It'll be a list of, both needs and things to try for that bucket. And we'll do the same when we talk about, so for white guilt, triggering emotions and how to deal with emotions, and also the sense of not knowing enough about race and race history to have substantive conversations. Does that seem clear? Okay. I always think it's fair. It's important for me to be as open as possible about the process, so you know where you're going. I don't expect you to just trust me. I don't think that's fair either. Yep, we will do that. So, all right, any questions or comments about the process? Well, then let's jump into white guilt. It's okay to laugh. It's okay. It's okay. It's like, I always tell people, like, when you're preparing people to have a conversation about something very serious, yes, sometimes it's important to be very serious. And, like, we bring our whole selves. Bring your human self. Like, we can have this conversation. The nervous laughter, the genuine laughter, whatever it is. That tends to be my strategy. So, here is some feedback that came in about white guilt. I actually, David said we're just going to have you read it. I'm actually going to read it out loud because I think there's actually something quite powerful about reading it out loud. So, the first bit of feedback here from somebody was, I suffer an extreme case of white guilt when the group is not all white. I am worried it might make all the students feel uncomfortable, especially the African American or Native American students. So that's a bit of feedback. Another bit of feedback from one of your peers is, I am a white, middle-aged, middle-class woman from a racially divided city talking about other white people, some of my ancestors, who created these situations, the things that are depicted. It makes me wonder if the kids feel about me talking about race the way I feel when there's a man talking about rape. What the hell does she know and understand about that? So this is some of what's happening here. You may have also responded with some experiences of white guilt, or maybe you didn't, but you held that and you didn't put it in the survey, which is also okay. That may be slightly different than this. But I want you to pause, and I'm going to have you turn to small groups, not to pairs, but this will be small groups. Try to bunch up in groups of 4 to 6. And just talk about this. Talk about your experiences relative to white guilt, how you feel it, how you might think patrons experience it. But I will give you the caveat that I think for you all, I want you to try your best to figure out how white guilt shows up amongst docents. Because that's the place where we have some authority to control and change what can happen. We don't control how visitors will experience something, but we can control how we engage with how that makes us feel. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes in your small group to talk about this, and then we'll do some group feedback and discussion. I'd like to invite you to wrap up your conversations. Wrap up your conversations and come on back to the large group, please. Come on back to the large group, please. So here's what we're going to do. Come on back, please. So I said I was going to come down because I feel really far away from you, but I can't because the powers that be say I have to stay up here because I'm being filmed. Womp womp. So unfortunately, I have to stay up at the podium. But what David will do is bring the mic around, and I would love to just hear you all share with each other what happened in your groups. That's it. How did the conversation about white guilt go? What did you learn? What did you talk about? Before we do some sharing, I am going to ask that we hold whatever comes out in this space in confidence, because we did not make an agreement to confidentiality earlier. So I would like us to do that. That applies to your small groups and the things that you're learning from each other, as well as what happens in this space. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't take your big learnings outside of this room. But, if somebody said something sensitive or personal or really vulnerable, you don't need to send an email to everybody telling them they said it. Just to honor and respect each other a bit that way. So with that as the precedent, let's hear what happened. Let's have some conversation, do a little analysis, listening and learning. I will call on groups. Don't make me call on groups. All right, I see a hand here and also a hand in the back. So 2 hands. Let's hear from both groups, please.
Cindy?
We're addressing the second paragraph there, and I didn't write it. I could have written it because that's how I felt at one time. This was quite a number of years ago, and I had a tour with a group of young African American men who were high school students at a Topeka school, I think, a private school. So I had a whole group of males. And it wasn't anything they did, it wasn't anything they said that led me to feel, coming at the end of the tour, like, gosh, how do they feel about what we're talking about being led by a white female, and so it was my privilege, it was my guilt that I was laying on myself because it wasn't anything they did. And so we're looking at this and we're thinking, okay, what do we do with this? What do we, I don't know what they were thinking. Maybe they weren't thinking that at all, and I was just laying it on myself. But obviously it's made an impression because this happened a long time ago and I still feel this way. And so that's my question. What do we do with this? So.
Thank you for that. Let's hear from this group. I am keeping track of, if as questions like that emerge, we'll have a chance to do some talking, and I'd like to give some feedback, but let's hear from groups first.
Our group talked a lot about the difficulties of some have experienced, particularly with the Lynch family. It makes us feel uncomfortable. It makes us look again at the composition of the group that we're talking with. But I think there was a consensus that we liked doing the piece because it's real, it's honest. The students, the groups we've experienced, really get into the conversation. And even if it makes us look at ourselves or feel guilty, we question the word guilt, but we feel bad that happened and is happening today. But the bottom line is it's a valuable conversation to have. So,
great.
Anything else? Yes.
Thank you. Other folks? Yes, there's a hand up here in the front.
We talked about the Lynch family too, and we talked about how we don't know what children come with at the age of 10 as far as the ideas of lynching. So, in our heads, we're thinking about all these different things. What do they know? What do they not know? And we don't want to be the bearer of bad news, saying things that they don't know. So you got the hamster wheel going in your head while you're trying to facilitate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Other folks want to share? Yes, here's another hand.
Our group talked about both of them using the word guilt, and how a lot of us who are white both feel maybe that we're removed from the guilt because we didn't do those things, or we didn't grow up in an environment where those kinds of things were even things that we were brought up to think were okay. But then I said that as I've gotten older, kind of the reverse has happened, where I've become more and more aware of the prejudices I held in spite of that, partly because I have a black stepfather and stepfamily. And so, all these years have passed, and I realized that I hate to even call them racist ideas, but my assumptions and stereotypes about what being black male from Philadelphia, military, Republican black male military, Southern California, who married second marriage, my mom passed away, married an Indonesian woman who's Chinese, had children together. You go through stereotype after stereotype, and you have to throw them out. And I just realize how many I've had the older I get. So there's both sides to that. There's a lot of guilt in my world. And I come to the museum with all of that, a lot of baggage.
Yes. Welcome to the Lot of Baggage Club.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Other folks inspired to share? Yes, there's another hand. Thank you.
Well, we were talking not so much about the Lynch family or the black experience, but with the Native American in our American Indian galleries. And a couple of things, talking about the winter count. We have a piece that shows events in the life of the Lakota, this particular group. Mm-hmm. And there's one there with smallpox, and talking about, the fact that their big event that year was smallpox. But there's also another square that has to do with blankets being provided to the people. That was a big event, and you wonder, there are all these rumors about that possibly smallpox and measles were spread through blankets that were not safe from exposing these people to those things. And then one time I had a station up there when they first opened the Native American galleries, and I was standing by the coat, but I was in back of it, and I was by the ferret. And a man came by, and he backed away from me, and I'm going after him because I want to tell him about it. And he was obviously an American Indian. I mean, you could tell he wasn't dressed in Native American clothing, but he was. And he wouldn't come over to me, and I said, I can show you this. And I said, would you like to look at it? And he said, no, I'm afraid of the power. And he backed away from me, and he wouldn't come. He almost left the room. Instead, he was kind of sidled along the wall and got away from me and got away from the ferret. I wanted to tell him, one of the things I tell people in there, that our curator was very sensitive when that room opened, that exhibit space. He had a shaman come in and bless the pieces that we had handled that were religious items, so that he was paying attention to that. And I think that helps explain the Nelson a little bit to our visitors, that we're sensitive, that the things they're looking at are things that might have not been on display to people, and that we're sensitive to their respect for spirituality that goes with those pieces that normally wouldn't have been seen by other people. And so I think that was, I don't think I handled it very well with the man that I chased around the room wanting to talk to him.
Thank you for sharing that. So raise your hand if you have experienced or felt something similar to what you heard shared in this room already from these groups. Okay. So there are a lot of folks who are having amongst you as a group of leaders, as a group of folks who have a very important role in this institution, who are feeling the same kinds of things. I want to offer you some things to think about around white guilt, including how to intervene or what to do differently or what does this mean. And I also own that, like, as a person of color, having this conversation with you, it's a little funky. Like, there are lots of great folks in Kansas City doing work on whiteness who are white and challenging white identity and white supremacy culture and the way that gets inculcated in white people, who are doing really phenomenal work in Kansas City, like incredible, transformative, life-giving work. And so I would encourage you to look to some of those folks, especially through a group called Showing Up for Racial Justice, SURJ, SURJ. But as your trainer today, I do want to talk about this with you. I want you to consider that guilt is not a feeling. Guilt is a state of being. It is a state of being. It's not a feeling. So when we talk about white guilt, oftentimes white guilt is a ruse for a bunch of complex feelings. But guilt itself is not a feeling. So I illustrate that by saying, let's say you're in a courtroom, and a jury comes back and it has been deliberating and is about to share with the judge what the outcome is of their deliberation. The judge will not turn to the jury and say, Madam Foreperson, the judge may say this, Madam Foreperson, tell us what your ruling is. Madam Foreperson is not going to say, we think that this person feels guilty. You either are guilty or you are not guilty. It is a state of being. So when we examine white guilt, if you feel it, if you're experiencing it, if it's tripping you up, the first thing you have to ask yourself is like, what actually am I feeling? What actually are you feeling? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel inadequate because you don't know an answer? Do you feel like you have a job to do and you don't know how to do it? Do you feel guilty because you think this person is going to hold you responsible for all the things your white ancestors did? I don't know. But the feeling is actually what you need to decipher. It is not the same as guilt. Because quite honestly, we could have a complex conversation about our definition in which white people are culpable and guilty because the system has set it up that way. It doesn't mean you are a bad person. It's the way the system works. So by omission, I think people feel guilty because there's a sense that, like, somehow I'm going to be caught for participating in whiteness or racism, either out of commission or omission. There's something happening. We don't know what to do. The first thing I tell folks is figure out what you're feeling, because that will help you figure out what's triggering that feeling. Which, by the way, this was like the non-segue, that the buckets of challenges that you've identified are actually very malleable. So David and I identified several different buckets. I named the 6 buckets. I said, these are the 3 I'd like to try to prioritize. But you will see that there's great fluidity, or like the walls of the amoebas are very porous. So you may be feeling guilt, or you may think you're feeling guilt, or you are experiencing that, but then you have to ask yourself, why am I experiencing this? Like, am I actually responsible for all the things that white people did beforehand that created this? I don't know, maybe, but in what way? Do I not know how to answer this question? And then that makes me feel like I'm not adequate or good enough? I don't know, maybe. Maybe that's part of what you need to sort out. I think the real challenge here is, like that I've been chewing on in preparation for our conversation today, is to help you all think about when you're in real situations. So there were folks saying, okay, tell us what we really do on the floor when we're in front of this piece. And we have no idea what authority we have as a white person to talk to a group that's mostly people of color about a piece of artwork that is depicting their life experience. Who am I to say anything about that? And so maybe that's actually the really important place to start, is just ask yourself, who am I in relationship to this piece of art? When we were preparing for this session, this training, I said, what's really clear to me is that your visitors come to have an encounter experience with the art. They're encountering the art. But in doing that, a visitor also has an encounter experience with themselves. Art, great art, inspires the encounter experience with the self. Who you are in society, what society tells you about what we do or don't do, what is right or not right, whatever that is. As docents, you're not any different. You are also having encounter experiences with the art. And then trying to help other people talk about their own encounter experiences. Remember, a little bit ago I said, you don't control how the visitors will experience the art. You have to ask yourself, how do I experience this? And is this actually an emotional trigger for me that's actually showing up in my feeling incapable or incompetent in helping people of color experience this piece of art? It's incredibly complex. I don't poo-poo that. But the place to always start is to say, how am I experiencing this? What does it mean for me when I'm on the floor? And then how do I engage in a conversation that is as authentic as it can be? Because I don't think that anybody who is of a racial identity group looking at the Lynch family, like I will speak for myself. If I were a docent as a non-black person of color, I would not try to describe to that black person their black experience based on that artwork. That's not my place to do that. Maybe there's a provocative thing to ask if that person chooses to engage. But as a docent, you might ask yourself, how do I experience this? Maybe you might discover that you, or some of you, might be willing to try sharing what it's like for you as a docent to experience that as a white person. Like that is kind of like, I think in the world of education in museums would be kind of amazing. That the question is no longer about how do I, as a white person, help this black person experience a piece of artwork that is about their history, but how do I share this from the place where this also tells me about my history? Might you share that with young people? Like if a child asks you about lynching, we don't want to be the bearer of bad news. Like I heard that, but the bad news is always, it's already there. It's already there. So there are big questions to ask. Will we engage in such a way that we will willfully choose to educate children in a developmentally appropriate way about a really terrible time in history? Will we talk to the children about the really terrible things that happened during the Trail of Tears? It's not about whether or not I want to be the bearer of bad news. It is the world we live in. But there is a fundamental shift around how we, one, understand white guilt, two, address how it makes you feel as somebody who has a job to do here. But it also begs the bigger question of the museum, what is our role to play here then? Simply to let people exist and experience that? That may be it. But is there an opportunity to teach differently? Which then you'll see, right? The porous walls of the buckets then leads to the conversation of like, well, what do we need to know in order to do that? Do I know enough? And is my sense of like, I actually feel like you might be a docent who says, I actually feel like there's a teaching moment there that I want to do, but I don't know how to do it. So then I feel really bad because I don't know how to do it. But I don't know how to ask for it because I don't even know how to put my finger on it. Like this is the starting place. I could give you a ton of interventions in a situation like that, but it would depend on your ability to execute on that intervention. Do you hear what I'm saying? You would have to be equipped, skilled, given the technical assistance, and supported by the museum in order to respond that way. I would love it if my mixed-race children could come to the museum and learn the truth about the Trail of Tears from all of you in a way that doesn't make people feel bad, but that tells the truth. But what I know is that means that you as a docent, I have to ask myself, how do I support you so you know enough to do that? You see, like the onion, you just keep peeling the onion and peeling the onion and peeling the onion until you get to the point of need. What do you need as docents in order to address that not knowing, or to address the liminal, squishy space that feels emotional and like unwieldy, that would actually help you intervene in a different way? So I want you to be able to see the big picture, and I totally hear that there's an urgency for an answer because we still don't know what to do on the floor. And maybe what you do on the floor is you just say, this is really a hard part of our history. You could choose to just say, this is really hard. It is really sad. What would it be like if a docent said, when I see this, it makes me sad? Like, we know that the point is to be visitor-led, and it's butting up against the opportunity to actually teach in a way that's effective for a desired outcome that is different. If the desired outcome is that we don't want people to experience something in an historical vacuum when they stand at the Lynch family, then it means we'd have to make a different choice, and we bring them to that piece with an express purpose of being able to hold what could be taught there. But then the precursory, the precondition to that is making sure that you all are equipped to do that, or those of you who want to do that are equipped to do that. I don't presume that every docent wants to do that. And you'll have to figure that out. But I want you to, this is the analysis. The analysis begs for something much deeper than just tell me what to do when I stand in front of this piece. I hold the sense of anxiety around not knowing what to do. And I urge you to just dig a little deeper and ask yourselves, what is the full story that's happening here? What is the fullness around white guilt? Because it's not that a white person can't talk about tragic things that have happened in history to people of color. I don't believe that. It's how you talk about it and how you frame it and what it means for you if you identify as a white person that you have to sort through. And that the museum needs to build a structure in which it can support you in doing all of those things.
Can I say something, Paco?
Yes, please, David.
Can we put this microphone on?
Can we get the handheld mic on, please?
I don't think it's on. Hello, hello. And I think as someone who manages the docent program, I think we still need to think about this deeply as a group. For example, there was one comment where they were having a conversation in front of the Lynch family, and some little girl referred to the colored person. And I don't think we're going to get to that bucket list, so I thought I'd bring
let's talk about it now. This is a perfect place to introduce it.
And what the docent did is, she was a little startled, the word colored was used, and what she did, she paraphrased and used the word African American. And I think that was appropriate. But I think what we need to decide as educators is that, do we use that as a teachable moment? Do we, in a nice way, explain how in this environment, of course we can't, we talked about this, we can't, of course, tell them what words they can use in their environment at home, right? But in a kind way, can we explain that in this environment, we don't use the word colored because that, for some people, is hurtful. And maybe explain why. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to have a conversation. I need to have a conversation with my bosses, for example. Do we just look at art, or is a museum a place to really kind of teach tolerance as well? And take a situation like that and turn it into a teachable moment and really do a lot of good. So I think we really are kind of asking ourselves the same questions.
Yep. And again, you'll see the layers of questions and points of intervention. And that a point of intervention on the floor is exactly what David described. You really could say, you know what, at a time people did call black people or African American people that word. And it was really hard. I mean, and I've been thinking about this too. I want you all to know, one of the things that I didn't tell you is that I did early childhood education for some time, and anti-bias education with young people. So I'm constantly thinking about how do we talk about this? How do we give children the truth in a way that lets them know what is real and how to engage in the world, but that doesn't destroy them, right? I mean, that's really important. It's a critical balance. But that I suspect that there's wisdom among all of you about how to do that. And there's probably wisdom among people of color who work in this institution who may not be docents who have that, because people of color are consistently having that conversation with our children all the time, just to survive. So I think that there is a wealth of resources already here if you could identify what questions you're really asking yourselves that will determine what you do on the floor. I saw a hand up here.
Here we go. Wait.
I was just wondering, with David's comment, my question was whether it was a white or an African American student that used the term, and would that make a difference in your response?
Well, my question is that a hypothetical question, or have you actually experienced children of color describing themselves as colored?
I haven't had that term used.
I'll be honest, I don't think I've ever heard a child of color describe themselves as colored. So this is why I'm saying, okay, that's an important question to ask, because I want to use this as an example, because part of what creates anxiety or triggers white guilt is the assumption that a particular thing will happen. So if we can get our hands around how we might respond to a white child who may use the word color to describe people of color or black people, what if black children describe themselves that way? I'm pretty sure black children aren't really good describing themselves that way. So the test is not to build behavior rooted in theory or hypothesis about what somebody will say, but to really gather what you all have already gathered in the survey data, which is what have we actually experienced? And then how do we respond to what is actually experienced? Maybe you'll get a dearth suddenly this year of children of color referring to themselves that way, and then we'll talk about it. I highly doubt that. So, because part of what can happen is when we presume or create a scenario that one, has not actually happened ever before, or two, is unlikely to happen. Part of what can happen is we get into what I call analysis paralysis. We have to analyze and be totally prepared, and then we have to know exactly what we would say, even if this thing would actually probably never happen, so that we feel confident. And there's just no way to achieve that. What we can achieve is to say we have enough data to show that these are repeat things that we experience consistently with young children, consistently as docents dealing with our own stuff when you go out. Use the real data that you have to create some possible new behaviors to try. It doesn't mean that every intervention that you try will work, but trying something is probably going to produce, you have a better chance of producing a different outcome if you try something. It's fairly simple. And you'll know what doesn't work. But that's again why you would have to decide what are our guiding principles around what we teach and how we intervene. Then what does that tell us about what docents need in order to achieve that? Because the last thing you want is to have some great value or desired outcome that you actually don't equip yourselves to be able to do, because then you set yourself up to fail. The institution ought not set you up to fail if the institution is saying, we want a different outcome. Because then you gain the skills to then identify the places where you'll practice something differently to create a bucket of best practices that you've tried and tested and then seen if they've actually produced a different outcome. It's like running a great campaign, or it's like running a great test. The whole point is not just to sort of willy-nilly try something, but you all to say, okay, in the bucket of white guilt, here's what our challenges are. Where are the low-hanging fruits that we could pick to try something different? Let's see if this produces something different. It's very methodical. And I actually think having a methodology for how you do it actually helps us contain what we feel. Because when we just let our feelings dictate something and we're like, I just don't like how that feels, so let's just do something that feels different, it's very hard to track whether or not that's producing a different outcome for the experiences of people of color, or for you as docents, or for white people who come here. Let's not say, this isn't just teaching to protect or hold children of color. It's also teaching the truth to white children who aren't getting it either. So that's a piece to remember. So as we snake back to this conversation about white guilt is the great immobilizer. It doesn't mean that we ought not examine white guilt, but as I push you in this conversation to dig beneath that, to figure out what are the feelings, what are the outcomes, what happens when we give into white guilt and we are totally immobilized? We're certainly not producing another outcome. Right? That's the thing to really chew on. But we can't solve today. But I know that there are people in this institution who want to have that conversation and figure out some best practices or try some different things. So that when a child says something inappropriate, or when you encounter an adult who says something inappropriate, it's an opportunity to say, okay, today I can respond because I was given the education, I feel confident I can say something, because I know what this means for me and what I want to communicate and how I'm supported by the museum. There may, in fact, be a liminal space in your learning as an organization and institution where you don't feel comfortable saying anything more than you say now because the institution isn't yet prepared to support you in that. That's also real. And then there's a bigger conversation to be had with the institution. If we say we want to do this thing, if we say we want to be a good partner, if we say we believe in equity, then how are we supporting the staff and volunteers to do that? Or is it just a looking good strategy? Those are very, very big questions that all shape how well you can be supported in your role when you're face-to-face with one person. I I'm conscientious of time. It's 3:44, so I'm real thankful I said we weren't going to get through all 6. But I also want to point out that, like, the 3 buckets that I encourage us to prioritize clearly have been woven into this conversation already. But I want to talk specifically about what it means to not know, not knowing enough, which is a trigger for a lot of people. I think it's interesting too, and I will say this very forthrightly, particularly because the docents that your group is made up predominantly of women. And I think the sense of not knowing is particularly profound in the way women are socialized. That women of all races, but race does impact us, but women consistently, I see and observe, are socialized to feel inferior if we don't know enough. That doesn't mean that there aren't men who also suffer from like imposter syndromes or not knowing enough. But if we go back to the borderlands and how people are socialized, men are consistently supported, white men in particular, to understand themselves as leaders, to understand themselves as knowing, innately knowing answers to stuff. I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that all white men know everything, because they don't. I mean, I live with one. I'm just speaking from my own experience. It's not speaking for all people. But there's a socializing factor. So when you have a group that's predominantly women and there's pressure to know enough or know everything, that's a compounding piece. So I just want to hold that. It's like, that's real. Like women internalize inferiority around knowing and being educated enough in very profound ways. And I bet it shows up here. You can assess how it shows up, but I bet it does. So I want you to pause and this will be a quick turn to your groups and have some conversation. But I want you to not just describe, I want you to actually not spend a lot of time about like, if you feel a particular way because you don't know something. But I want you to actually turn to each other and say, what do you want to know more about regarding race in order to do your job the way you want to do it? In order to do it the way we've been talking about it. So as docents, what do you want to know more? What do you need in order to do your job this way, as we've been describing it? So let's take 7 minutes to do that. I actually think that will be good for just diagnostically, because we should know. Like, if there's a way the institution can support you, this is one way to begin surfacing that. So 5 to 7 minutes in small group, and then we'll do feedback, and then it'll be 4 o'clock. So turn to each other, identify what you need. All right. So we have a few minutes left. What I'd like to have us do is do some sharing about what came up in your conversations around your needs. Now, I recognize that I presumed you would want to do this in order to identify your needs. But let's just hear from one another what you want in order to have more of these conversations about race, not just around your work when you're out working with visitors, but perhaps between all of you with your own self-interrogation as a group, your own reflection, and what you'd like to be able to do as a group. It can encompass all of those things. And we'll have some folks on the education team, is that right?
Yeah.
Thankfully, thank you, taking some notes so that your needs don't get lost in the ether. It's helpful to write them down.
And I just want to let you know, I looked outside, it's not snowing yet, okay?
So I'm keeping you till 5. Just kidding. I'm not keeping you till 5. My kids are already texting me. So let's just hear. Give us a taste of your conversation and some of the needs that you identified for yourselves.
Well, one of the things we talked about was the change of our institution just in the past 10 years, thinking about how much more representative of the greater Kansas City community our visitors represent today than maybe they did 10 or 15 years ago. And we think a large part of that is due to Julian's leadership and his more inclusive exhibition programs. But there was a lot of intentionality that went into that, and along the way, we were thinking about things in terms of how we recruit docents to be more reflective of the communities we want to serve, to make the community feel that the Nelson is more inclusive. So I think we learned some things along the way, but I'd just be so curious to know what we still don't know. Like, what are the communities that still don't feel welcome here and why? What is the school student experience when they feel unheard and why? If I don't know if you get constructive, pointed feedback like that, but we need to hear it and know so we're aware of what we don't know. And I think if there's a way to research that among communities that don't feel that welcome here, I would love to figure out how we get that information.
Great, thank you. So I hear a desire for having more access to, like, what is the feedback from the public, from folks who are coming here? And I would encourage you to take the data and then ask yourselves, what does that tell us about ourselves? Like, that will tell you on the surface something about the communities and their discomfort. And then there's, like, you remember, just keep peeling that onion and then ask yourselves, what are we doing that creates that discomfort? Because oftentimes historically white institutions will say, well, people of color are not happy here or they don't feel welcome, so let's hear what they have to say, but not actually ever challenge what it is that we're doing that is producing that outcome. Because generally people of color having a negative experience is just, it's a symptom of something that's happening someplace else. That itself is actually not causal. That's symptomatic of something else that is being caused somewhere else. And usually it's inside the institution. Yes?
A breakthrough comment that came from our group was this idea of, can we break, as they call it, the fourth wall, and say as a docent, this makes me sad. And that was so helpful to hear. This makes me sad. We ask our visitors, what's going on in this artwork? Or even, how does this make you feel? But to say, this makes me feel a certain way is something, it's certainly not written into our tours, and that's that breaking that wall where we turn into a human being standing there with our own reaction.
Yep. Thank you for that. I will be transparent with you that when we were planning this training session and we were talking about what could be transformative if docents could engage as viewers of the artwork themselves too. No different than anybody who comes in here. No different than somebody who's having an emotional experience with something, because that's the place where if you wanted to do something that I think would be transformative in the industry and in the sector, but also allows people to engage with the value of vulnerability and transparency and truth-telling, like, it's very basic. You can't teach people to do that if you can't do that yourself. Like, and as a parent, I think that's very clear. Like, I can't teach my kids to do something if I can't model it for them. And particularly if you're working with young people and we want to model new behavior, like, not only, it could be affirming for a child of color to hear a white docent talking about how this makes them feel and as a white person. I think it's even more powerful for a white child to see a white person having that conversation, because that's actually the conversation that doesn't happen. We talk a lot about the trauma and suffering of people of color, but I want us to think about what would that mean? So that we don't become like navel gazers of people of color's trauma, but people who share our own experiences. And as a white docent, you could connect with a white child to help them understand whiteness and power in a way that they would probably never understand, and probably wouldn't understand if we only ever focused on people of color's trauma. So that's, something to sort of give you some grist to think about. I saw some other hands over here about what you might need or want.
So I guess I have a very pointed, and I don't think it'll happen, but it would be wonderful to actually hear from the advisory committee that was formed to help with the exhibition that's coming up, the 30 Americans. And I know that's we're kind of late in the game on that, but it would really be wonderful to hear some of the discussions, some of the remarks that advisory committee had, et cetera, while they're planning to bring that exhibition here, because those are the voices of some of the leaders in the African American community, specifically here in Kansas City.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. Thank you. So another piece around access to information and conversations that are happening, things that will help inform you understand better the exhibitions and the work.
Yes.
I always think of art as a reflection of the time it was made. So and I feel like I know to a small extent what the artist's intention was with the Lynch family. I think if everybody understood the context in which it was made and how it came to the museum, and we were able to mirror that or discuss that in reference to how we feel about race relations today, that would be something that would be really helpful. And I know the American tour that I had most recently, the kids are already talking about civil rights, so I think they know more than we do, honestly, about what's going on, and I think our prejudices might be holding us back in being able to deal with it. They probably have a much better handle on what's going on than we do.
Yeah. That's great. So what I hear when in your feedback is like, you know, it would be great to have like some technical assistance. Like, let's learn about the history related to certain pieces. I think and it could be a really interesting learning series for you all to go a few pieces at a time. We know you can't do everything full scale all at once. But if you could develop a discipline in which we say, okay, let's talk about the racial context and history around this particular piece. What do we need to know? And you might even say, how do we have those conversations in a developmentally appropriate way with children? That there are people who have that skill. I'm having those conversations with my 8 and 10-year-old all the time. So there are people who can say, oh, you can frame it this way, or you could frame it this way. Or if you're a white person, maybe you want to try framing it this way. If you're a docent of color, maybe try this way. But just to try to workshop piece by piece so you have something to practice with without feeling so overwhelmed. Because it can be really like, oh, we don't know anything. Well, now we have to learn everything. Like, no, that's like nobody wants to drink out of a fire hydrant. So like piece by piece, like how do we be strategic about it? How do we with some methodology and methodically learn how to do it and build some infrastructure that will support your success? That doesn't depend on you knowing the racial history of every single piece in the museum, because you can't possibly know that, but enough to do your job in a more effective and fruitful way. I want to be conscious of time. It's 4:03, but I also want to make sure if there's anybody who has another burning thing that you want to share here. This is obviously not the last time you can share. You can email it to each other, email it to David and others, and Jamie to talk about this. But I want to just make sure, in case anybody wants to share something now.
And I just want to let you guys know is that a big reason we're having these conversations now about implicit bias, about race, is we're working up to 30 Americans, which is going to be a difficult show for some of us to work with, okay? There's some really difficult issues that are tackled in that show. So, and we're right now thinking about what is the best approach. And we're thinking that, and this is something that Stephanie Knapp, the curator, is really pushing, that this should be all about conversations. It's not be about art history. It's not about understanding artistic intent. It's really understanding what the viewer is seeing in these works. Because I think the last thing we want to be are some white person telling some black person what this picture means to them, right? So we're really we've been really thinking about this, and this is just the beginning of a conversation, so it'll continue until next year. But as I think we can see, there's no easy solution, but we do have some good data to work from. And me and Jamie were just talking about how perhaps we could just maybe have some workshops perhaps next year after 30 Americans where we can kind of brainstorm some ways of dealing with these sensitive issues in the galleries. So again, this is just the beginning of a conversation. Okay? So thank you for coming today. Thanks for staying late. And thank you, Paku.
Thank you so much. And remember, these are glasses. Put them on. Put them on. Try to describe what you see when you put on the glasses.